Okay, so what I'd like to do then is to move to our, penultimate talk today, where we hear about the future of clinical science training.
All right, well, we'll get started early, maybe have a little extra break time. I'm Keanan Joyner, and really excited to be here with you guys today. They tasked me with the incredibly difficult job of predicting the future. If I could do that, I would make a lot more money in the stock market, but unfortunately, I cannot. So the future of clinical science training. I have been reading a lot of James Baldwin recently, so you're going to get a few Baldwin quotes. This is a good one. The future is like heaven. Everyone exalts it, but no one wants to go there now. It's very comfortable where we are. We know what we're doing. We feel like we have a lot of skills that we can implement and train students with. But the future is changing, and that's why this is one of the themes of this summit, is trying to figure out how we build the future of clinical science so that it can continue to evolve over time. So these are the four themes that we're getting ready to go in and discuss about building collaborations across clinical science programs, training for the foreseeable and also the unforeseeable future, how we can build flexibility into the internship preparation and experience to enhance clinical science training, and training for clinical science careers outside of academia. So I thought it would be useful to think about the core of who we are as a field. What are our roles as clinical scientists, and how will these change over time? There's a fantastic paper. Several of you helped write this paper, but I thought I would just, again, highlight it and direct folks. It's really worth reading, both the main paper and the supplement, where they have a lot of survey data on training the next generation of clinical psychological scientists. And there's some really nice quotes from here that I think help ground us. So what are our roles? What are we doing? It's what we've been talking about. The central goal of clinical psychology is to reduce the suffering caused by mental illness. Right? Clinical psychology, a field anchored on the deep integration of basic science and clinical practice, is uniquely positioned to serve as a transdisciplinary hub for this research. And then there's the whole debate about too much science, too little science, how obviously, as Bob talked about the history and as we all know about the emergence of the clinical science kind of model that came out of a lot of these debates, and as they still continue to go, as we stay fairly siloed, as was just highlighted in the last theme. And so I think the core question is, how do we stay true to these things, these principles across time, to address the needs of our nation and the world that look to us to relieve the burden of mental illness as those needs evolve in real time? Because these trends are changing across time, whether we do something or not. People are still struggling with mental illness across time, whether we do something or not. So these things are going to continue to change and evolve with social trajectories and trends, regardless of what we do. And our job is to think into the future of how we can prepare our trainees now to be able to flexibly meet those demands. And so, we've talked about a lot of things, worrying trends, and this is largely, actually, I think I have some of the same graphs as Bob had. But what are we going to do about it? The prevalence of mental and substance use disorders stays fairly the same, and maybe goes up across time. I won't say where I was born on this graph because it tends to make people's back and knees hurt a little bit, but it's been going up my whole life. What are we going to do about it? Death rates from mental health and substance use disorders. What are we going to do about the suicide rate? We have to do something different. The same things that we've been doing are just not going to work. So what does the future hold? Well, really, the future is just what we make it. What decisions we continue to actively choose now will shape what our approaches look like into the future, because our trainees will become the ones to train other trainees in the mental health community clinics and dissemination of clinical science. So the future is really whatever we want it to be. It will be a self-fulfilling prophecy. No matter what we decide, that will be what it is. So I think there's three main points that I am fairly sure of that seeing into the future about what we might consider when we're thinking about how to build this into our training. And I think that the future is incredibly multidisciplinary. Right? Numerous surveys. I won't belabor a lot of the data here. We've been talking about it over the last 2 days. The extraordinary diversity of training goals for clinical psychology trainees. The varying amounts of clinical practice and emphasis on actual application, dissemination, different roles, varying research methods when we are staying within academia. There is a huge umbrella, I think, in pretty much all of our departments. We have several of our clinical faculty that are cross-listed in other areas. Cogneuro, cognition, social personality, you name it. We have clinical psychologists also in these domains, and they carry those research methods into our study of psychopathology. Also varying settings for work. Where are people going to work? Because the reality of the situation is that most of our trainees are not going to be academics, and they're also not going to actually be in private practice across time. More and more and more, there are varying degrees of dissemination and implementation work happening in the tech sector. Like Apple is doing this stuff, Google is doing this stuff, and they will continue to do that. Our question and what we have to decide is how well will our trainees be prepared to step into those roles as opposed to someone without a clinical science background. Because Google X and Moonshot and all of these places are going to try to capitalize on an increasingly digital world to deliver these types of interventions, if you can even call them that. They are trying this stuff. And our choice is, do we want to be involved in that setting? And so that's one of the core things that we're going to be talking about in some of the work groups, is the clinical science careers outside of kind of this academic sphere that we're all comfortable with. And it feels very uncomfortable to think about things that we don't know about. It's a path not taken. Right? What do all of us know about working in industry if we never worked in industry? So it's going to require us to really rethink and be creative. I have talked to some of my colleagues. One of my colleagues, Celeste Kidd, she's in the developmental area, and she doesn't do clinical science work, but she's really thought a lot about this issue of preparing most of her graduates to go into industry. She has started applying for industry jobs. She was like, what does this application process look like? I'm trying to figure out how to advise my students on how to do a resume instead of a CV and all this stuff. Now, I'm not suggesting that we all go and do that, but that would take a lot of work, and I haven't been on this job too long, but I do know that I would be already too busy to try to fit that into already my busy schedule. But the point is we got to get creative here. How do we find ways to learn about these other settings? Because that's what our students are going to go into. And if we want to have a say and we want to influence these domains into the future, we have to find ways to integrate this and learn a little bit more about the things that we don't do, the choices that we didn't make and the path that we didn't take. We've got to find a way to do that and figure out what these various settings are like so that we can speak into those spaces. And then another perennial problem here with the multidisciplinary umbrella that we all fall under in clinical science is, how do we accommodate such different training goals under the single umbrella of what we call clinical science? And this is where I think that collaboration among programs is going to be extraordinarily important. And I'm really hopeful that that work group can really come up with some really actionable suggestions, because we can't do it all at any of our one programs to accommodate all of these different goals. And a lot of the ways that we want to do it to increase the readiness across this broad umbrella boil down to essentially more training, right? And that's what we're here to talk about. But where do we add that into our curriculums? People have been talking about this the last couple days. I love we need the science of subtraction, right? How do we do that without losing the essence of who we are? Where is that space? And so one of the spaces that I do think that's been a hot topic and should continue to be talked about is with clinical training. We have so many hours that students do, and if we have less hours there, it's more hours for other things. But we have to be careful. This comes at a potential cost. And I think back to my graduate training, and Therese Kemper, who some of you guys have gotten to chat with this weekend, who's a total gem and a great MI therapist. I walked in as a first-year student at Florida State, and I had the audacity to look her in her face as the clinic director and be like, I am going to do the least amount of clinical work possible in this program. I am going to shirk it at every corner. I am here for research, right? And she looked at me like a great MI therapist and didn't try to push back. She said, okay, we'll see about that. And we ended up becoming great friends, and she provided fantastic clinical training. And now, as I went on, part of my story is a little bit non-traditional or a little bit complicated, because when it got time for me to be a fifth year and I was thinking about applying for internship, it also happened to be a worldwide pandemic that year. And I sat alone with my thoughts for a little bit too long. That can cause some problems. And I was like, I really don't want to do my clinical internship. I really love research. I am hyper concerned about economic conditions. Mom and dad could not provide a safety net. I wanted to be able to buy a house, plan to have kids, things of this nature. And I was like, I would like to go on the job market. And so that's what I did. And I was very fortunate, very lucky in many ways for it to work out as it did. And I ended up at Berkeley. And so I didn't do my clinical internship. And a lot of people are like, well, wasn't it such a waste of time to accrue 600 clinical hours while you're in grad school? And no, because I couldn't have gotten to where I did in my research and where I was at Berkeley without those hours. Those were integral to my research training. And so let's not overcorrect. And I don't think anybody is suggesting that we drop the clinical work entirely from the degree, but it is at the essence of who we are, and we should not lose that as we make proposals to move forward. But please, let's move fully away from this hour-counting madness and on to operationalizing minimum competencies for things like internship. For some students, they may be just fine with 100 contact hours to develop the competencies that they need to be able to go on for their careers. And for other students, they'll need 600, right? But this hour prescription means that every student is making a decision independent of us about how many hours they think they need for their internship. And that determines what content they can put into their training and how much time they're going to spend on different things. And, it really gets in the way of our goal of integration. Bob Levinson and Ann Kring and Steve Henshaw at Berkeley, they put together this amazing thing that they call specialty clinic. And the way that it works is you sign up for our in-house clinic, hours you're going to see clients. You design a treatment. You collect data on it, right? You test it out. You recruit patients or participants, depending on how you look at it, both, right? You try out this treatment. The supervisor is the faculty member, and then you write it up. You talk about this new innovative treatment that was developed and tested. That is the pure integration. But you know what our students complain about? Is, well, I'm going to get less consistent hours because, we have to design the treatment, and then that whole time I'm not seeing the client, and then we have to recruit, and all the thought is about this hour counting, right? Even though the design of it is the essence of integration of research and practice. And we've got to get away from that. That will stymie our efforts to meet the evolving needs of the future as they come up. And this leads us to some flexibility in internship, which is another topic, and this is only part one of maybe infinity. I believe that internship is the portion of the training process that is the most potentially adaptable to the changing needs of the future. As Jennifer Callahan was reminding us yesterday, is that gap between dissemination and implementation is quite wide. The half-life of knowledge as it goes on. Internship is potentially a 1 to 2 year process of this very specific and immediately applicable training process that happens at the end, the capstone of a trainee's kind of preparation for whatever career they're choosing. That could be an incredible launching pad towards all of these diverse set of goals. What about, being able to provide flexibility in that process to be able to immediately adapt to a new pressing need, to give internship directors the autonomy and flexibility to be able to design the optimal training experiences. But there are really endless regulatory pathways and implications of trying to move it to postdoctoral or separate it from the degree that comes up state by state. Please, I hope that we have these conversations about how different laws that are on the books for state licensure and for APA and PCSAS and so forth, how those all work together in lockstep and how those would have to change to accommodate more flexibility in the timing or the type of internship that we put at the end of our training program. But it is this optimal point to be able to focus in and get really great mentored training towards whatever evolving needs our society has. So how do we navigate this legislation to align our field's incentives with regulatory structures and incentives that get into state politics and just even filling seats on boards of psychology at different states is a nightmare. And plenty of people have been talking about this over the last couple days in conversations over coffee and such. We got to figure out a strategy for us as a field to try to align what we want, what we see as best for society and public health with these very structures that we're embedded with. Another thing to think about is how we align the goals of the training program, the internship site, the setting that the internship site is in, academic medical center, the VA, DOD, et cetera, and the regulatory incentives on internship. All of these incentive structures are different. And we have to make broad sweeping changes for something like the internship process, we've got to find ways to align them. I encourage everybody to talk with the internship training directors. They have things that they want to do with our trainees that we're sending them. And the programs, us, the faculty, want them to take care of things that we don't want to deal with maybe, or what we want our graduates to get. And those don't always align, and we have to find ways. Yes, please go talk to Tara. She will talk to you about these things. I have had just wonderful, wonderful experiences talking with Tara, with Wayne Siegel, Shona Voss. Please go talk to them about these things because it is a really difficult thing to do. The academic medical centers or the VAs that they're housed in also have different goals, oftentimes than them, the same way that sometimes our universities have different goals than us as individual faculty. And we have to solve these issues if we really want to make these broad sweeping changes. And I think that we can do it, but we've got to talk to each other and we've got to really take this on. The next thing is that the future is increasingly digital. This is happening just on a massive scale. Almost every single US adult has a smartphone in their pocket. 96% of people 18 to 29, 95% of people 30 to 49 have a smartphone. There isn't as much of the gaps between white, black, and Hispanic folks in smartphone access. It's still pretty much smaller than all the other gaps by race that you see for home broadband access. This is happening. And it's going to continue happening. Our world will become increasingly digital over the next 50 years. And treatment for engagement in treatment is going up. And these changes in who is actually getting treated is often being driven now by this increase in telehealth. And we all know that this is here to stay. I'm not telling you something that you haven't already been talking about. We know that telehealth is going to continue to dominate this space. So it provides a lot of opportunities, but also a lot of challenges that we need to start being very forward thinking about these things. There's tons of research implications of the increase in the digital age. So studies that establish equivalence of teletherapy or teleassessment in in-person versions. What happens when the client has spotty Wi-Fi? I've read several papers that came out pretty early in the pandemic talking about doing cognitive assessment, over Zoom. And they say, oh yeah, you can validly assess, the whisk or the waist. And that's great. I know that it's possible. I'm not trying to talk ill of these studies. But what happens on block design when your Wi-Fi cuts out for just 3 seconds? Do you invalidate that subtest? What happens in the reality of what it means to translate what we do as clinical psychologists to the digital age? What happens if your therapy client doesn't have a private room? We don't even know whether you're not talking about something because the partner that you are scared of or in an abusive relationship with is in the room with you. We don't even know as therapists that you're just not sharing. How could we, right? And so we've got to think about some of these very practical dissemination and implementation questions that keep coming up again and again this summit. We also, I think, need to increase by a lot interest, valuation, and funding more than anything into stepped care models. These digital things in our pockets will be here for the next 50 years, and they will continue to evolve. And we need to think about how we can leverage them, not to replace in-person psychotherapy, individual psychotherapy, et cetera, but how does it complement? Can we use these incredibly accessible and widely available and used tools to act as a sorting agent that catches people before their symptoms become severe and reserves the more individual traditional psychotherapy for more severe clients? Can we deliver and push digital interventions? It's great to see the literature over the last 10 years. I could show you, a million of these citation graphs and everything else, publication graphs, right? That people are making these like digital interventions. And that's great. How many of those are actually used in routine clinical practice outside of your academic centers? It's almost never. No one's just accessing those online because you know what? It takes a lot of digital infrastructure to host those. You need to understand a little bit about servers. You need to understand a little bit about IT, versioning, right? Is it compatible with updates to the iPhone? Every time they update an iPhone, they update the App Store. Will your digital intervention be able to keep up with that? Do we have the technical expertise within our teams to think about the very low-level, non-psychology things that it takes to translate our work and actually put it in people's hands to where it's used? This will be the challenge of the next 50 years. We have to think about bridging those gaps. Also, research samples. AI and large language models like ChatGPT, we're only on GPT-4 right now, they're advancing fast. And people who do not take it seriously what that means for online experiences will be left behind. Look, I am, as much as anybody else, critical of some of the gender and race biases in ChatGPT. But I have been astounded. My student she primarily works in Python. I primarily work in R. I would love to learn how to code more efficiently in Python. I don't know. But you know how we communicate on her research projects at the moment? I write up the function that I would use in R, and all I do is paste it into ChatGPT and ask for the Python code. It has not given me an error yet. It gives you lots of errors because we do a poor job actually describing what we want it to do. Language is incredibly imprecise, and we don't take that seriously enough. You give it code, it translates between languages at astounding accuracy. And this is only going to get better with time. And we need to really think about what that means for when we design our online research studies, which also are increasing in frequency in the literature. We need to have field-wide norms about online research, bot detection, data quality screening, all of these types of things. And we also need to think about the huge opportunities that these types of things and these types of tools play to help accelerate our research. And then the last big point that I am very sure of is that the future is drastically more diverse. By 2050, the Census Bureau projects that non-Hispanic whites will no longer be a statistical majority. There'll be a plurality, of course, but not over 50%. The proportion of African Americans will have grown by over 30%. The proportion of Hispanics will have grown by over 60%. The proportion of Asian Americans is projected to over double. This is happening. These demographic trends are moving this way. This will be the way in the next 25 years that we see. But we're incredibly unprepared for this. And we don't think about the systemic structures of what that means for our research as clinical scientists. Because diversity is great for science. I'm not going to try to get you to understand from the value side of why you should care about DEI. I think we had fantastic talks and focus on that yesterday and infused throughout the talks here. I'm just going to try to convince you from a scientific standpoint, we all lose by not increasing diversity of our research teams. We do worse science by not having more diverse people on our teams. This is an incredibly interesting paper by Hofstra and colleagues that titled The Diversity Innovation Paradox in Science. And so they analyzed PhD dissertations across 3 decades using some really fancy computational models. And basically what they found is that students from underrepresented racial backgrounds actually had more innovative connections in their work than students from non-diverse backgrounds. But they also weren't recognized for this innovation. And these are some of the examples that they give of this. So for example, HIV and monkey research, right? That connection was initially drawn, and connecting previously disparate fields. And that for a lot of reasons that personally makes sense to me, students from underrepresented backgrounds make more of these connections because they haven't been trained in this exact mold that we've all been trained in. And they often see these connections that we don't see. And we need more of this in our science to really move this needle. And another James Baldwin quote, if we don't measure it, we will not change it. Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. We should really look at all of our numbers. What are our programs doing? So these are just the national averages in very generous clinical psychology. You didn't want me to pull up any clinical science data because it's a bit worse on this front specifically. But this is data we're all familiar with. White folks are, generally speaking, overrepresented from the national averages in clinical psychology PhDs. Hispanic and Black and Indigenous folks are underrepresented by quite a large margin. And so practically, if we wanted to achieve racial representation, that would involve solving several aspects of structural racism, but I'm running out of time. And so the low-hanging fruit that I really want to push us all to think about doing it immediately, and we can go back and do tomorrow when we go back to our institutions, is to prioritize pool utilization. And so everybody's heard about this leaky pipeline construct. Let's really be scientists about it and think about high schoolers into psychology undergrads and grad school applicants and so on and so forth. I think there's a really special junction from undergrad to grad school that we're missing out on. You look at Indigenous, Black, and Hispanic folks, they're roughly at their national averages because there's a relative overrepresentation in comparison to all majors within our major for these racial minorities. And we are doing something that is losing them from this junction from undergrad to grad. And we need to find out exactly what that is and how to fix it immediately. So there could be these student interest factors that we need to solve. Grad school isn't for me. I can't afford a PhD. I'm not qualified. But our institutional responsibility immediately should be to ask, what is our stats on pool utilization? You have the data at all of your grad schools. How many people from different diverse backgrounds applied to your program? How many did you invite to interview? How many did you offer admission to? Those numbers exist. You have access as faculty to all of those numbers, and we don't analyze it. We don't actually sit there and produce a report every year to look at these things, to track these things. Oops, went forward too much. And now I can't, okay, there we go. Do we have any strategy? Do we actually have a stated strategy? Are we trying to attract diverse applicants in any specific way, or just kind of hoping that they come to us, that they'll show up somehow in our pool? Are we trying anything intentional? And then are we preparing our undergraduates well? I would work with, and I am hoping to work with, our psychology undergraduate advisors and ask, are they applying to grad school? Is that equitable across race? What are we doing at home to prepare our undergraduates to apply to everybody else's programs? And I also think that this matters for flexibility in internship. We all know pay on internship is a big issue, and this is so much more so for folks from underrepresented minority backgrounds. We know that the gap in income between upper and middle lower income households is rising, right? And the middle class is falling out the middle, right? Well, that's almost entirely driven by Black and Hispanic folks. That's not a middle class problem. That's a Black and Hispanic middle class problem that we talk about as if it's all of us, right? This uniquely affects us. Inflation, don't even get me started from a statistical standpoint on, they calculate inflation by just dropping outliers. Did you guys know that? Like the inflation count, if gas went up by 85%, they're like, oh, that's clearly not in line with the rest of inflation. We'll drop that in our calculation of the CPI. That's not how anything works. Anyways, it is continuing to go up. So the purchasing power of the dollar has fallen across time. This is uniquely hitting Black, Hispanic, Indigenous folks. They are looking at the prospect of a law degree with an even additional longer internship of suboptimal pay without the wealth that happens that is in affluent white communities that's concentrated there in our country. We have to think about this as a DEI issue. Internship is a problem from this perspective. And if we want to diversify our field to make sure we have the practitioners we need to address the needs of a more diversified population with mental health needs across time, we've got to think about some of these economic realities that our field is taking part in. And then let's say that we get the few Black faculty that get through to, to the professor level. What's happening with the tenure process? So this is the paper that Bob introduced, the Ginther report. I really hope that all of you guys will go and read this and discuss this at your faculty meetings. We're 12 years past this, and the modal person that I talk to at conferences has never even heard of this paper. It is terrifying that we have such a large gap in R01 award percentage by race of the PI. That is unbecoming of a field such as ours. And we have done nothing about it. And so, I won't belabor the results here that Bob already mentioned, but the one that I do want to focus on is this follow-up paper. This hot paper came along, and they thought that they had discovered a really big kind of a gap in the logic. It's not just the race of the PI, it's what they study. It's that the institutes that they submit to more often, that the topics that they submit to, there's a smaller funding portfolio for that, and that accounts for 20% of the funding gap between Black and white PIs. Y'all understand why that's worse, right? Like, that's definitely way worse, is that the taxpayer dollars that Black folks are paying into our system that's being reapportioned to NIH, we systematically say the things that you guys care about, we will give less money for. That's terrible that that is what's happening. But how many of your institution counts R01s in the tenure process? How influential is having that grant for promotion and retention? What are we doing when we're thinking about evaluating applicants and an already low funding rate and low pay line? How do we think about this systemically to solve, to be able to have the diverse faculty that students from diverse backgrounds want to work on topics of incredible societal importance for underserved communities, but we won't fund that. And so there's no funding for those faculty to take the students, and those faculty aren't getting tenured. How do we solve this problem? We've got to go to NIH. We've got to demand change at the funding level for some of these systemic problems that they continue to bake into the system. So we've got some very real challenges ahead, but I really believe in us. Look at this summit. What people were able to organize, all the conversations that are happening. I mean, hey, if we can stay on time for a whole summit, we can solve anything, right? I believe in us. Do you guys? Keep the conversation going. Let's imagine the future, because the alternative is what we have right now. I don't think anybody in this room is really satisfied with that. So there is never a time in the future in which we will work out our salvation. The challenge is always in the moment. The time is always now. So the future is what we make it. Thank you.